Welcome back. This is the third of a three-part presentation that is looking at the implications of the Chinese cruise, and of course that cruise circumnavigated Australia in early 2025. This time I'm going to look at how the cruise showed us just how hollowed out the Royal Australian Navy has become. And then as the cruise goes along around Australia, we're going to look at the resulting strategic dilemmas for the Australian Defence Force. I'm also going to look at the ADF leadership. As always, in these long, slow looks, I'm also going to look at how the Chinese cruise highlighted the strengths and weaknesses in a strategy of attrition. Two branches of the ADF went down in part 1 and part 2 of this series, and yet the cruise is still no more than a third of the way around in its circumnavigation of Australia. One of the most astonishing developments for me is that as the cruise ventured further south, the ADF leadership surrendered control of Australia's maritime heartland. That heartland is roughly an arc running from the port of Brisbane down around to the port of Melbourne. What happened during the cruise was comparable to China abandoning the South China Sea. According to the available timeline, the ADF first expressed concern about the Chinese movements on the 10th of February, and one Australian frigate, HMAS Arunta, was dispatched to intercept and shadow the cruise. 11 days later, she was on her way back to base. Interestingly, despite a warning period of almost 2 weeks, no other Australian ship or Air Force Poseidon was available to take over. Instead, that role passed to New Zealand. Now, what's interesting about this is that the New Zealand ship was actually beginning a major 6 months overseas deployment. The only other New Zealand frigate was halfway through a year-long major refit. Both Australia and New Zealand were, therefore, probably quite lucky that there was even a New Zealand ship available. That's just extraordinary. If the cruise had happened a few days later, it is quite possible that neither Australia nor New Zealand would have had a frigate available to shadow the cruise until HMAS Stuart was able to reach station. And of course that didn't happen until the 24th of February. So, sorry, it just staggers me. It's not just Australia that you have to think about in terms of this cruise. International actions by the Chinese armed forces always deliver a message, sometimes bloody, to other countries. But Australia was largely free from threats until China expanded the capabilities of its blue water navy. So in considering the cruise, you have to look at the message China was conveying. Ignoring the live firing exercise to consume the media, and based on available information, the cruise ducked in towards Australia on 2 occasions and put some rather interesting sights within missile range. It first, and most importantly, clearly showed the Chinese were capable of reaching the AUKUS submarine construction facilities, as well as the Poseidon's home airfield nearby. The second time, not coincidentally, was the site of the proposed maintenance facility for not only the AUKUS submarines, but also the American and British over in the West. It's about as clear and open threat as is traditionally made under China's strategic culture. The final statement was when they sailed around Tasmania. The Chinese fishing fleets are huge, and they're always looking for new fishing zones once they've stripped mines the ones they're using. This message wasn't for us. It was for their fishing fleets. As they have done against the Philippines and the South China Sea, the Chinese Navy was saying to their fishing fleets that they can now protect them in the rich waters off the Australian exclusive economic zone. Not only were there implied threats in the cruise, the Chinese were also looking at how we would respond. I think they were quite surprised by the results. Firstly, there is something wrong with our frigates. HMAS Arunta was dispatched on the 10th. It met the Chinese cruise in the Coral Sea about halfway between Sydney and the Torres Strait. An Anzac frigate's estimated cruising range is double the actual distance she travelled while she was at sea. Yet she's back in port within 10 days, and there is no clear explanation as to why her time at sea was cut short. Equally, if it was caused by insufficient fuel or supplies, the Navy's 2 replenishment oilers HMAS Supply and HMAS Stalwart were not available to keep the Arunta at sea, and that's another interesting fact in its own right. The only other frigate based in the east was actually in the middle of a prolonged period in dry dock over in Western Australia. Unbelievably, we had only one frigate available on the entire east coast, and from publicly available sources, she appeared incapable of performing her mission. HMAS Stewart was based in the west. Her deployment to meet the crews covered double the distance Arunta covered, and she was at sea for about 4 days longer, and then she shadowed the crews after an at-sea replenishment. This at-sea replenishment is another one of those interesting events that the Chinese would have found fascinating. Still, with respect to the two Anzac frigates, there is a clear and unexplained disparity between both ships' ability to stay at sea. Then there is the replenishment itself. The New Zealanders provided the replenishment ship, as both of ours, the Supply and Stalwart, had been out for repairs for more than 6 months. It is just extraordinary, and it had a tremendous impact on what is happening in our maritime heartland. Availability problems for our replenishment ships appear chronic. Without them, it's a little unclear the Navy could have maintained constant contact if the New Zealanders had not been there. A quick note on the Kiwi involvement. If you presuppose that the Chinese were interested in how Australia responded, we seem to have been very, very lucky that the tiny New Zealand Navy was there to save the day. The Chinese probably didn't even consider them before they set sail on this cruise, but if they had waited less than a week, the results of this cruise would have been astounding. The availability of the one functional New Zealand frigate stopped the crews from travelling nearly 1,000 kilometres, ranging roughly from Williamtown to Hobart, without any naval shadow. As noted, the only reason HMAS Stewart was able to resupply at sea was because of the availability of the New Zealand tanker, but it was only temporarily home. It was between 2 back-to-back resupply missions to the Antarctica. If it had not been available, there would have been no Australian naval vessels shadowing the crews for a minimum of 4 days, perhaps longer than 7. Sometimes luck is on your side, but Australian strategic policy should not be reliant upon it. And what's actually fascinating is that despite the desperately needed New Zealand contribution, what they actually brought to the table was incredibly minimal. Neither their Poseidons or frigates have any anti-ship capability. Yes, that's right. The number of anti-ship missiles they can carry is exactly 0. The helicopter carried on the frigates can launch a Penguin anti-ship missile, but only after the helicopter flies a suicidal 150 kilometres, all the while in the range of Chinese air defence. Hopefully, if it came to the crunch, the flight crew will get their posthumous medals before they take off. In all honesty, it's probably why they don't have many Penguin missiles, and they are in such small numbers that they only recently launched a Penguin for the very first time. It has only taken the New Zealanders a decade. New Zealand's 4 Poseidons are also problematic. Understandably, given the size of our 2 defence forces, Australia was to provide major maintenance for the New Zealand aircraft. But the New Zealand Air Force has less than half the number of technicians needed to provide basic maintenance on their base. How many of their Poseidons are actually capable of fully performing their role, let alone fly, is unknown. On the day of the first live firing exercise, Admiral Johnson advised no New Zealand Poseidon was in position. At Senate, he was asked, why didn't one of our P8s pick this up and report it earlier? His response, because it wasn't approximate to the firing at that time. That's a rather bureaucratic way of saying there wasn't one there. When pressed as to why the first reports came from a civilian airliner, and this is, it makes me so angry, Admiral Johnston, quite astonishingly, stated that it was reasonable to expect a longer delay for this type of information to go up the military ladder as there were more steps involved in military communication. I found this statement, in fact at this time his leadership, untenable. This was the single most important military incident for Australia this century, and neither he nor his staff had the common sense to ensure that communications to ADF leadership was almost instantaneous. I actually had flashbacks to reading about the French commander in 1940 not even having a radio at his headquarters. Now the point I'm trying to make in my usual roundabout way, despite the emotion, is that the ADF saying that it was New Zealand's responsibility for the coverage in this period does not alter the fact that neither the Royal Australian Navy nor the New Zealanders had the capabilities to do what was needed in Australia's maritime heartland. It was pure luck. It's actually, by saying it was the New Zealand's responsibility, it's the equivalent of America handing over surveillance of the waters off New York to the Canadians because the United States Navy didn't have enough ships or planes. Although it made sexy headlines, the actual live firing by the Chinese was relatively unimportant and actually met accepted practices. It's just that our standards are much higher. Bluntly, no missiles were fired, and although their ship's guns are vastly superior to ours, even they can't hit targets 1,000 kilometres away. Whether or not you agree with the Good Admiral's statements over the difficulty of advanced warships and naval aircraft not hearing broadcasts on emergency wavelengths, and honestly, I don't believe him, the real problem is the breakdown in communications between New Zealand and Australia. It took nearly 2 hours for the information to get from their military to ours. That's an absurd length of time when Australia was handed over monitoring a potential enemy task force. In a crisis, it would prove disastrous if the sole source of information on a Chinese cruise were the New Zealanders. After all, the Chinese are not going to issue a warning that they are going to fire cruise missiles at Australia. Hopefully, in those circumstances, someone on the New Zealand side would pick up their mobile phone. Whether or not they have the correct contact details is altogether another question, but based on current evidence, they do not. But going on, and this is where it gets truly shocking, an Australian Poseidon did actually pick up the warning. Where they were is a little unclear, as it stated they can be hundreds of kilometres away and pick up the broadcast, and certainly Admiral Johnson didn't believe they were there. Where they were misses the point. The crew of an Australian Poseidon heard the message, but either didn't bother to report it, which I'm pretty sure they would have, or it died in one of the steps in the military communication chain that the Chief of our Defence Force thinks is acceptable. It simply doesn't matter really what happened. It's just absurd, and even the Chinese would be astonished by the absolutely appalling communication standards that we seem to find acceptable. And this brings us back as to why the lack of an Australian ship shadowing the Chinese task force is an issue. Admiral Johnson was to later imply that the handover to the Royal New Zealand Navy was a prior agreed strategy. My personal belief is that this strategy, given the size and capabilities of the New Zealand Defence Force, was an informal agreement made during some jovial evening in a mess. If the agreement was reached in the week we became aware of the cruise, then, as I've said, it was pure luck and not strategy. His comments were, at best, misdirections from the problems within the Royal Australian Navy that were highlighted during the cruise. At the hearing, ideally, senators should have pressed for details as well as a timeline for this agreement, but they did not. Regardless, if the lines of communication between the New Zealand and Australian Defence Forces were actually this bad, then the cruise should always have been shadowed by Australian Defence Force ships and planes. Alternatively, if the Kiwis were not available, under some prior agreed strategy, the Admiral should have always ensured there are enough Royal Australian Navy ships in the east to cover the Kiwis' absence, but he clearly did not. Admiral Johnson made no attempt to cover the planned unavailability of either the 2 New Zealand frigates or their supply vessel. He only reacted when the cruiser's objective was clear and then dispatched HMAS Stuart to the east coast. To put it in perspective, if the Chinese had launched a cruise missile attack against Williamtown, then the delay was equivalent to allowing the missiles to fly for upwards of 1,000 kilometres before the message made it up the chain. Obviously, hopefully, in a crisis that's an absurdity. But so too is what Admiral Johnson believes is an acceptable communications network. I've seen examples of Swedish command and control exercises from the 80s whose leadership team would be horrified by what we consider acceptable nearly half a century later. In modern warfare, minutes wasted leads to more lives lost. The simple truth is that, almost certainly to the astonishment of the Chinese, the appalling communication structure that is acceptable to Admiral Johnson and his leadership cohort would suggest that, if replicated, even a relatively small surface task force has the ability to launch enough land strike missiles to cripple our Air Force and probably escape unscathed. And always remember the power of these Chinese vessels. If we put to sea every single ship in the Royal Australian Navy and concentrated them off Sydney, then they would only have slightly more vertical launch systems than these 2 Chinese ships. Obviously, any comparison is far more nuanced than that simple equation, but on almost all metrics, the Chinese ships are superior to ours. Now, also a note on the Chinese tanker, and this is really quite fascinating. The Chinese are significantly increasing the number of tankers that can replicate the cruise. Currently, there are 9, and depending on the source, they are building another 4 to 6 this year or early next year, and all in the same dockyard. It's just incredible, their build capacity. Now, the Chinese Navy was involved in anti-piracy operations off the Red Sea, and they have already shown they are capable of maintaining 2 ships on station for 4 months. That's actually impressive by any measure. And the extra tankers now enable the Chinese to simultaneously repeat this exercise on both sides of the continent of Australia without impacting their crucial naval heartland of the South China Sea. So the cruise passes through the Tasman, leaving in its wake proof of insufficient resources, substandard communications, and bluntly, poor leadership. I have decided, due to length, to remove the discussion on what I meant by a maritime heartland, and also the lack of infrastructure needed for strategic resilience. I'm going to include it separately, and prior to that on New Zealand, as it feeds into that later presentation. As the cruise travelled westerly along the southern coast of Australia, the results seemingly became less dramatic, but in reality they again prove the DSR is a conceptual failure that's created a flawed defence policy or strategy. There is often extensive discussion on so-called grey zone warfare, whether it be cyber or challenging maritime boundaries. Let's be honest, it's only grey zone because we lack the guts to do anything about it. I don't necessarily say we should do something, I'm just pointing out that it's only called grey zone warfare because we choose to define it that way. The cruise entered our exclusive economic zone off the coast of Antarctica. This area, for the Chinese fishing fleets, remains one of the few maritime regions that has not been subject to their strip mining techniques. The importance of the cruise is as proof of concept for the Chinese. They can now provide a fishing fleet with naval protection, even if it is by their large Coast Guard ships. Again, I am not saying that the Chinese fishing fleet is going to descend upon our exclusive economic zone tomorrow. It's just that they have proven to both Australia and themselves that they can do so in the future, and have now seen how we react. Conversely, there has been no discussion in Australia just about this possibility, and absolutely no discussion at all about what we will do or should do if it happens. And equally, we're not really talking about or even planning for what assets we would need should we choose to resist any encroachment. The transit past South Australia was inevitable if you understand the Chinese way of using military posturing to force a favourable outcome. In many ways, this was the key message of the Chinese crews, both domestically within China and for Australia. The importance of the Osborne shipyards currently is as the sole facility for the maintenance of the Collins-class submarines. At this time, 3 are laid up allegedly undergoing major refits. The reality is that there simply isn't enough infrastructure at Osborne to do more than one boat at a time. It just looks better to have them listed as undertaking major refits than as unavailable because we are unable to maintain them. Currently, the far more important site is the Edinburgh Defence Site. It is a primary base for the Poseidons and of course the Army's 10th Brigade. Irrelevantly, it also holds the headquarters of our expensive and largely useless Space Command. Still, it would be quite extraordinary for China to conduct a strike against Osborne or Edinburgh in the foreseeable future simply because the military risks and international response would outweigh any benefits from such an attack. The importance of the cruise is not this region's current infrastructure, but what it potentially represents. And that, of course, is that it is the site for the construction of our AUKUS submarines. In theory, 15 years from now, the first AUKUS submarine will be under construction. Equally, based on current production rates, in 15 years the Chinese Blue Water Navy will be twice the size of the United States Navy, and unlike the Americans, almost totally focused on the Western Pacific. In the interim, the Chinese will undoubtedly reinforce their domestic and international propaganda to mobilise opposition to Australia obtaining nuclear submarines. Of course, domestic propaganda started immediately AUKUS was announced. Since then, state-run media continues to reinforce the belief that AUKUS is a threat. This will only lead to expectations that the state, in other words the CCP, will eliminate it. Failure to do so will cause a negative reaction domestically. Meanwhile, international propaganda will aim at bolstering existing opposition to AUKUS amongst other nations within Southeast Asia. As I've noted in Part 2, it is already quite strong, Part 1, and that is especially true of Indonesia. It is a constant surprise to me that the AUKUS submarine is seen as a long-range strike system using its VLS, but we ignore the fact that Chinese will have a significantly large number of boats before we even have one, and that they can employ the same missile technology. So the CCP have set the scene and have a reason and the capabilities to attack the AUKUS facilities. The question is, what are the military risks to the Chinese? Even a small task force such as the one on this cruise, would have the ability to inflict massive damage to the AUKUS shipyards, as well as RAAF at Edinburgh. But the most likely method would be submarine-launched cruise missiles. There are no sensors available to detect the missiles until they come within range of civilian radar networks. Even then, the detection distance for subsonic sea-skimming cruise missiles could be as low as 15 kilometers. At that point, it would be too late for any reaction. In theory, we could detect the rather noisy launch if we had the ability to hear it. Again, Australia has absolutely nothing comparable to the Japanese SOSUS network, and absolutely no plans to implement anything remotely like it. So our southern approaches are completely deaf unless we are lucky enough to have a Poseidon or ship conducting ASW operations in the area. However, we simply can't ignore the tremendous reconnaissance advantage the Chinese obtained from their massive satellite program. It would allow them to simply wait for the best time to attack. Obviously, we need to develop the ability to intercept as many missiles as possible. Currently, we would need to permanently keep aircraft in the air or have the sensor network and facilities to get fighters into the air in time. That, of course, brings us back to the availability problems of the F-35 that I mentioned in part 2. It also means the RAAF would have to deploy aircraft back from the northwest and therefore risk weakening any pivot to the north. Alternatively, we could protect this region with short-range air defence missiles. Again, we would need to develop the long-range sensor network and command facilities to be able to use longer-range missiles. Funnily enough, this brings us back to my constant harping on mass. How much air defence can we put in place due to cost and personnel? Do we put enough in to enable the interception of all the cruise missiles from just a single submarine? Or do we plan to have the capacity to intercept missiles from 2 submarines? Of course, the Chinese have the ability to apply enough mass to overwhelm whatever defences we put in place. Also note that air defence in the Middle East have shown to be fairly ineffectual against submarine-launched cruise missiles. A significant factor in this is the delayed reaction times due to the attacks happening while in a state of relative peace or even just semi-conflict. The Chinese are not restricted to using submarines. They could also launch a devastating attack from a task force similar in size to the one that was used in this cruise. As an aside, there were some interesting discussions on such an attack, on the possibility of such an attack in the media. One comment that I heard was that, hopefully, we would quickly destroy the Chinese ships. I'm not actually that sure. Even with a Chinese surface task force, the risk of a strike against Edinburgh and Osborne over the next few years appears minimal. They can launch more than enough missiles to overwhelm any air defence while retaining enough firepower to overwhelm the few obsolete Anzac frigates available in Fleet West. The Hobarts, of course, are based in the east. They are unavailable in this scenario simply due to how the Royal Australian Navy actually reacted to this cruise. If a surface task force did launch an attack, then continental distances kick in again for the Air Force. The Chinese could launch an attack from a point up to 3,000 kilometres away from Williamtown, and quite possibly more, while the Poseidon's base at Edinburgh would be damaged and at least temporarily knocked out. The distance from Williamtown is too far to launch a response without considerable planning. Just getting the tankers in place adds hours to the response. If it took 10 hours to organise an attack, then the Chinese task force would be up to another 500 kilometres away from the launch point, and that seriously complicates any response. The only real risk is the Collins-class submarines, but it is becoming increasingly unlikely that we would have enough boats available to both patrol the north and be in place to intercept a task force in the south. Again, the Chinese will know much more about the Collins due to their reconnaissance and intelligence systems than will the Australian public. Even before we launched any response, and I admit this is a cheap shot, we would need a civilian airliner to report the strike. This will save an hour if all we had to rely on was the ADF's communication network. Now, there are a lot more variables to consider, not least the political, all of which will delay our response, and some of these, especially the political leadership, could delay the response quite substantially. Then there is the great unknown that I noted in my book. The longer the delay between an attack and any response, the more likely it is for the great powers, and in this case we're mostly concerned about America, to avoid involvement. What we are seeing in the Middle East is that the big powers talk tough, but when faced with the potential of a major conflict, back down and expect their clients to just take the punishment and not respond. Examples include Biden's restraining the Israelis after the Iran launched a massive missile attack against Israel in 2024. That was a declaration of war, if ever there was one. In 2025, the situation reversed, and Russia and China failed to take any significant action in response to the Americans destroying Iran's nuclear weapons facilities. And they also appear to have discouraged Iran from making good on its threats in the Gulf. In our own region, there was a sinking in 2010 of the South Korean warship by a torpedo launched from a North Korean submarine. Of course, more currently, in the Philippines, China just keeps putting the boot in. Sadly, as I noted in my book, the only way to avoid American prevarication is to respond to any raid by getting bloody as quickly as possible. The possibility of China managing a raid to minimises the chances of an American response, let alone how we ensure an American response is made to a raid upon Australia, is completely missing from the DSR narrative. Bluntly, would America risk a wider Pacific war in response to a sub-launch missile attack on the Osborne shipyards? In terms of an Australian response, the real question for the Chinese is whether Australia will have any Virginia submarines, though they themselves may still be a decade off, and they'd also have to know how many we could actually have at sea. Which of course brings us to the only pillar that means a damn thing under the DSR, and that is, of course, our alliance with the United States. Even then, the most important element is the United States Navy, not just its ships and submarines, but it's also its impressive ASW air arm. This is why, as the Chinese crews sailed west, the implied threat to HMAS Sterling, and especially the promised upgraded submarine dockyards, was a hollow threat for some time. As I've noted in previous presentations, HMAS Sterling's upgrades are primarily for the United States Navy and Royal Navy submarine operations in the Gulf. And that role is far more important than what it will contribute to the Pacific. Therefore, Sterling will be as close as you can get to the only critical US submarine naval base in, of all places, the Indian Ocean. That essentially makes it off limits. Of course, in a wider Pacific war, all bets are off, and the risks to HMAS Sterling increase dramatically, especially in those first few hours. At the very beginning of this series, I noted that I would discuss the implications of the cruise on the strategy of attrition that I proposed in an earlier presentation and in my book. With that last statement, I have to address the real issue of bias in these presentations. I have never hidden my disdain for the DSR in its current form. Has this disdain shaped how I look at the cruise? The answer is, of course, yes. However, in my defence, I have constantly reviewed these presentations on the cruise to the point that it has been repeatedly delayed and often rewritten, and that's simply because I want to keep the bias to the minimum. My honest conclusions, based purely on the Chinese cruise, is that Australia still fails to look at the threat from a Chinese view, and instead looks at mitigating our preferred version of any Chinese military threat. In essence, we have an eggshell strategy. As many others have noted, it is very good at defeating the single threat model once. But with the proviso, the Chinese do not apply too much force. However, expanding the threat model as the cruise has done spreads the DSR far too thin, potentially so thin that it collapses before a shot is even fired. As I've noted in my previous presentation on geographic scale, this was always the risk when dealing with the continental distances involved and the developing Chinese industrial, technological and financial capabilities. The whole purpose of the Army is now to defend the so-called islands within Australia, especially the bare bases and RAAF Tyndall, from which the Air Force will decimate an attacker. If the RAAF fighters are not deployed, these islands change from being a threat to a target. Equally, the Royal Australian Navy Surface Fleet, especially in its current state, a state that will not change for the better part of a decade, cannot operate in the northwest without the support of the RAAF. However, the simple reality is that the RAAF, no matter how good its pilots and their planes, and they are very good, nor its remarkable organisational ability and its remaining highly trained support staff, is simply too small a force to defend a continent. And the choices made in the last 2 decades are making it worse. We tend to get mesmerised by the range and firepower of our missiles while ignoring continental scale. We also tend to ignore vital risk factors such as China's superior reconnaissance capabilities and the risk of sub-launched cruise missiles. It's not helped by the constant barrage of press releases by Defence and the Minister. The reality is that without the RAAF, the DSR is largely meaningless. Back to the relevance of these events to the strategy of attrition that I've previously presented. The cruise showed some serious weaknesses in the strategy of attrition, but in general, it came out of it rather well. This is largely because the concept is designed to withstand the first shock and keep fighting. Not that it matters, for the defence establishment is ideologically committed to the DSR no matter what. Following the same path as a cruise has taken shows the strategy of attrition as being superior right from the beginning. The concept of the permanently manned fortified zones providing a mobile strike and reconnaissance capability ranging out to at least 1,500 kilometres, it provides continuous coverage of the cruise from the moment it left Indonesian waters. It meant that we could keep the task force under direct and continuous observation with the maximum possible warning times of any attack. It would also change the missile mix of the Chinese ships as they have to protect themselves from large numbers of mundane drones. This, of course, reduces the number of cruise missiles available for land attacks. Equally, the notion of having the most suitable patrol craft for each particular zone means that the naval component would vary from fast attack craft as well as surface and subsurface drones for the Torres Straits to larger craft with greater range for the northwest. As the cruise sailed easterly and then down the coast, it would pass from the coverage and potential strike component of one zone to another. The result of a strike against the zone itself would obviously cause serious damage, but at a great risk to the cruise from any immediate counterattack. The principle of attrition remains the same. Have the ability to absorb the first blow and keep on punching. Under this attritional model, the really strange concentration of the professional Army's primary strength in Townsville is gone. Instead, the responsibility of the ADF is manning the fortified zones and the major training facilities in the southeast. The real mass is, of course, provided by the Reserve Army and its supporting arms. In raids launched by surface ships or submarines, it has no role, but is subject to a call-up in a crisis. In other words, in a rather interesting result, a Chinese raid of this type may inflict damage, but will actually increase Australia's defensive mass, making any type of subsequent fait accompli using boots on the ground so much more difficult for China to achieve. You can oversell this argument, but it's interesting. I will again argue against an overwhelming reliance upon missiles for mass. Mass is also people and the equipment and infrastructure to both protect and support them. The evidence out of Gaza is that Hamas was able to sustain itself despite suffering thousands upon thousands of casualties. It remained a force to the end. Perhaps we will actually have peace following American intervention, but my bet is that Hamas will rebuild its strength and regain control of Gaza. And please note, I am not in any way, shape or form a supporter of Hamas. But, in other words, Hamas won. Conversely, to the north, Hezbollah accumulated an upside estimate of 100,000 missiles and drones, largely supplied by Iran. Its focus was on the infrastructure needed to launch and resupply its missile offensive, not its own survivability. Most importantly, it relied upon an exaggerated assessment of Iran's capabilities to act as a deterrent against an Israeli ground offensive. For over a year, or nearly a year, they launched a continual barrage against northern Israel that forced the evacuation of up to 60,000 Israelis. It was really quite a successful bombardment. Then Israel launched a ground offensive and Hezbollah collapsed. Obviously a bit more nuanced than that. The Israelis planned it and did some remarkable things at the beginning, but Hezbollah didn't last long. Relative peace was brought to southern Lebanon and northern Israel on Israeli terms, and Hezbollah is struggling to rebuild. Of course, both campaigns are far more nuanced than this brief summary. Their focus of these campaigns is on ground rather than naval campaigns. Still, the lesson to take from them is that it's about understanding the threat and getting the combination right. Back to the attrition strategy. In it, the RAAF is now concentrated in the southeast, and the bear bases are gone. Its primary role is to now provide air defence for Australia's demographic and industrial heartland. The crews simply reinforced that need. The fragility of the F-35 that's become obvious since I wrote my book has come as quite a shock to me. I've discussed in detail that fragility in part 2 and what options we could be looking at. Although still very restricted by distance, the RAAF does have the capability for very limited incursions to the north, the northeast and the southwest, especially if the aircraft that we get to replace the Super Hornet and one squadron of the F-35s are not tied to major airfields as our current planes. The Royal Australian Navy is also concentrated in the southeast, largely because it needs to survive the opening stages of any conflict. Losing ships in the northwest in the Timor Sea may prove to be the stuff of legends, but it destroys the ability of the Royal Australian Navy to protect our sea lines of communication or threaten China's. Note that concentrating the Royal Australian Navy in the southeast is not the recommendation I made in my book. Originally, I had a fairly balanced force divided equally between Fleet East and Fleet West, both with two different roles. Fleet East provided the support to the United States Navy in the event of a major Pacific War and had priority for ships, while in a regional conflict not involving America, the reverse occurred. However, even then, the initial role of Fleet West was to survive the first shock so as to become a long-term impediment to Chinese operations against Australia. When I wrote those recommendations, the procurement pipeline for the surface fleet was much more robust. It is clear that the Royal Australian Navy will not have the numbers to maintain two balanced forces on either side of the continent. While the GP frigates will provide a much needed boost, the reality is that the first 6 are simply replacing the aged Anzacs, and the first Hunter will not sail the waves until the mid-30s at the earliest. So if we are lucky, and in Australian defence procurement we never are, there will be no growth in our surface fleet until around 2035. Which brings up another point. The advantage of the attrition strategy is that it is adjustable to new realities. Hence, the role of the Royal Australian Navy went from 2 oceans to 1. Conversely, the best description of the DSR is that of postmodernism. It attempts to create and maintain a reality simply by putting it down on paper. As noted in my book and earlier presentation, the Army Reserves in their current form are redundant with the creation of a Reserve Army. Instead, I used a rather old term, Local Defence Volunteers or LDVs, were to take over responsibility for the air defence of major cities. The crews highlighted the obvious, which is that the concept of air defence being reliant upon any type of part-time force is fatally flawed. The response times are too short, and the needed 24/7 manning levels are far beyond that an LDV equivalent can provide. Instead, I believe we probably should go down the path of another professional branch, dedicated purely to the air defence of major Australian cities and infrastructure. This should include Darwin, even though it is in a fortified zone which has its own air defence. But it should include Darwin for no other reason than appearances. This professional air defence force needs to be a separate branch just to retain independence of purpose and reduce the risk of its budget being siphoned off. The crews identified another major weakness in the attrition strategy. Bluntly, I shortchanged the Special Forces. Originally, in my book, they were largely seen as an adjunct to the overseas deployment of volunteers drawn from the Reserve Army. It is pretty clear their specialities are needed as Chinese influence and perhaps a military presence steadily increases in the island states to the north. This is exactly what we did using small civilian ships in the lead up to the Second World War in the Pacific. However, this presupposes a different structure combining our intelligence agencies, elements of the Navy such as the Ghost Shark and the Special Forces. It also requires a different attitude, policy and goals for the next decade. Of course, this will not happen as long as we continue to pretend that we can prevent China gaining influence and projecting military power into and from the island states to our north. This cruise has highlighted the vulnerability of Australia's AUKUS program. The submarines shipyard in South Australia is the problem and always will be the problem unless or until the Chinese blow it up. Its location is all about jobs and nothing to do with common sense. I've never been a fan of AUKUS, but as noted in my last presentation, it's far too late to change paths given what has happened to the procurement pipeline for both the Army and the Navy. Ideally, we should pack up the whole damn facility and move it several hundred kilometres to the middle of nowhere. However, back to reality. Unlike the DSR, under the attrition strategy, there was at least a substantial increase in ASW sensors, such as SOSUS, an air defence system, and that was combined with a permanent fighter presence. Conversely, under the DSR, there's none of that. Instead, as the years progress, more and more of Australia's ASW assets, especially the Poseidons, will have to focus on the southern waters. Even then, I don't believe it is reasonable to expect we can prevent some form of successful raid on our submarine infrastructure under either strategy. I also believe some type of raid is inevitable simply because of domestic pressure resulting from relentless propaganda within China. The Chinese can now draw a so-called line in the sand to minor countries just as much as America has in the past. Let's not forget that the weaker the smaller power, the more likely military action will take place. Syria, during the civil war and the collapse of its armed forces, had the various factions bombed relentlessly by everyone who could, including the Turks, the Americans, the British and the Israelis. Meanwhile, countries such as Iran and Russia threw men and material into the mix. Loss of sovereign power is a terrible thing for the citizens of a country to experience, unless you are the manufacturer of body bags. Now, why do I think a strategy of attrition is superior to the current strategy of denial as developed under the DSR? Firstly, it's a little silly to think that they are not the two sides of the same coin. The weapons we have are applicable to both. Under the strategy of attrition, the fortified zones clearly rely on denial, but as noted in my book, they must be backed up by a robust manufacturing and logistics system that can enable them to operate for as long as possible. And that means a much greater focus on the mundane rather than exquisite weaponry, although the latter are also essential. Behind that, there is the Reserve Army. It provides the mass that must be overcome by any hostile force. If you like, our defence changes from an eggshell to a shot put. Like a mass, it's extremely difficult to break the shot put, and you still need to apply a massive amount of force just to get it out of the way. The ability to survive attrition makes it a superior deterrent. To my mind, the difference between the two strategies is that the DSR is completely reliant upon denial, while the strategy of attrition is far more balanced. I would much prefer a greater role for the Royal Australian Navy, but the reality is that, over the next decade, the only way we can actually significantly increase Australia's defensive mass is through the ground forces. It is cheaper, will provide defensive mass in a far greater region of Australia, and perhaps far more importantly, it is the easiest and quickest of the three branches to expand. That is, if we do it soon. With that, I've come to the end of this series of presentations on the Chinese cruise. I hope you have found them all thought-provoking. I usually conclude with some interesting readings. On this occasion, I will only point you towards 3 articles in The Strategist that is put out by ASPI. They're largely on the same subject of Australian sovereignty within the Alliance. This is something that I have addressed in earlier presentations in my book, especially the presentation on the sword and the shield. While I try not to get overly critical of other writings, I have to say that the first reading by John Coyne is really quite facile. I'm only referencing it because the author is one of ASPI's senior staff members, which almost by definition gives an insight into the mindset of the Defence Department bureaucrats and ADF command. At one point he refers to America's difficulty in understanding our concerns over sovereignty. He writes, US officials are often bewildered when Australians raise concerns that alliance cooperation might compromise sovereignty. Their response is usually straightforward. If your elected government made a sovereign decision to pursue this partnership with parliamentary authority and public mandate, how can sovereignty be at risk? The obvious response is that the US always puts its interests, in other words sovereignty, ahead of any agreement, and they are quite right to do so. And that leads me to a very good article by Michael Pizzuto. In it he notes that, contrary to Coyne's assessment, there hasn't been any debate or even any explanation to the electorate of the massive changes happening in our defence arrangements. He recommends a different decision-making structure to preserve our sovereignty. Incidentally, this is pretty much my position, as those who have followed these presentations will attest. Essentially, the need for discussion and my support for both America and Taiwan is part and parcel of all these presentations. The third article by Ross Babbage is actually a much more nuanced version of what Coyne should have written. Links to all 3 can be found in the overview. While they make an interesting and important debate, my real concern, and why I've actually brought up these 3 articles, is that Coyne is showing what I call an Olympian complex. It's a growing tendency amongst those in defence to view themselves as members of some type of pantheon of gods whose words and acts, no matter how capricious, are not for mere mortals to challenge. Instead, we should just accept whatever misery that may result, which, I guess, makes me a heretic. See if you agree, and thank you very much for your time.